right, Diana and Mallory, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you on.
Thank you for having us.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
it's our pleasure. I wanted to start um, by saying, well, thank you again for tackling what I think is a topic that is so underrecognized and so important, the topic of being single and being single in the church specifically. And also, I think in part we're here to celebrate the launch of a podcast that you two will be doing, the Soloists, in the Faith Matters podcast networks. And we're just so excited about this. So I thought maybe a good place to start would be to ask you, as you know, embarking on a podcast project is time consuming, is difficult, is vulnerable, all of those things. So, why is this topic important enough to both of you that you would dedicate so much time and effort and energy to doing this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think back to the first time I met Diana. We met over Zoom just months ago, and the conversation just like fell out of both of us. I want to say we talked for like 2 hours, and there was just so much to discuss. And she was able to give language to a lot of things that I had felt but hadn't really been able to figure out how to express. And it just it just became very clear that we'd been sort of suffering in silence in some ways. And I think that's the idea here, is that it's not necessarily about just making the suffering of being single super public, but it's about being able to show how normal and regular it is. And it just became, I think, a deep call. And I don't want to speak too much for you, Diana. I'm excited to hear what you have to say too, but a deep call to try and figure out how we could help people like us, single people, feel more whole on a regular basis. And we had both spent a lot of time thinking about that, because you don't really have a choice. Like, you're either going to deal with it or not, or you're going to get married or partnered out of like sheer fear and avoidance of how awful it feels to wonder if there's something wrong with you because you're single. And yeah, we would love people to be getting partnered for better reasons than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything Mallory said. We just had an awesome conversation. Like Mallory said, it just like kind of came out. And in addition to feeling like, oh, we're not alone, I felt like when I was talking to Mallory, I was like, this is all actually so interesting. Yes, there's a lot of suffering and confusion and feeling so lost, but it was also so clear to us the spiritual growth that is required as you have to really consider, like, what am I going to do with my life, since plan A, the plan that I thought was laid out for me, that I almost had no choice but to follow, when that isn't there, like, what am I going to do? And it's a really scary question. And there is a lot of pain and darkness, I think, in encountering that question, and a lot of loneliness too, because it frankly just isn't talked about enough. I'll also just say, in terms of a statistical point of view, in the fall 2021 general conference, Elder Gong and Elder Ballard both mentioned that over 50% of adult church members in the United States were either unmarried, widowed, or divorced. That's huge. First of all, that's much higher than what Pew Research is saying about married Latter-day Saints. In 2014, they were showing that around 67% of American Latter-day Saint adults were married. So to now say that over 50% are not, that's like a rapid increase in the unmarried population.
Sure.
But either way, even that Pew statistic is saying at least a third are unmarried, right? So that's just to say that when we're in a church that feels like such a linear trajectory, that you go on a mission and then you get married in the temple and you have kids and teach them to do this, when now like potentially over 50% of people just don't fit into that story, you're leaving people with a lot of gaping questions about like how they belong here, and whether they've failed, and what they're supposed to be doing with their lives, and how the community is supposed to support them. So I think it's a pretty important problem.
Yeah. I think that we have this maybe beautiful focus on the family that sort of leaves this potential to create identities around your marital status. And I think you both have sort of helped me see how there's sort of a shadow side to that has really been invisible to me. And so can you talk about that? Like, talk about singleness and marriedness as an identity, and how can we maybe go deeper in a way that would be fruitful for whatever situation that you're in.
Yeah, I
Mm.
think last year I found myself really drawn to this particular therapy group that worked with people who were dealing with either chronic disabilities or were in palliative care. And this man at one point gave this beautiful talk about disability and how people often react with fear or repulsion, or even maybe almost like a condescending putting disabled people up on a pedestal. But it was never very humanizing. It was either way, you're creating some distance, you're doing a little bit of dehumanizing because the experience on some level scares you, or it feels like, oh, well, that's not me. Like, I'm not dealing with what that person's dealing with. And he brought up, I thought, a very good point that if you're lucky, you will join the disabled population at some point. Like if you're lucky enough to live that long, you will probably lose your hearing. You might lose your ability to for your limbs or for your eyes to fully function. There, you will probably experience disability at some point in your life. And so we tend to think of these things as like, oh, this person's disabled and I'm able-bodied, but we all have disability within us. And I think singleness is similar to this, where it's like your spouse could die or something could happen and you could be single tomorrow. And the same is true for single people meeting someone tomorrow. So if we attach ourselves too strongly to one of these identities, and in this case, I think there just tends to be a lot more like cultural acceptance of being partnered than being single, we run the risk of singleness carrying a heaviness that doesn't even actually make a ton of sense. Like it's not going to protect you from reality. You know what I mean? To be like, oh, I'll never be single. I feel so bad for this single person over there. Like, oh, what's wrong with them that they're single? Because that's like such a huge part of being single is people trying to figure out why you're single. But if we had less of an identity orientation and more of seeing it as a circumstance or situation that genuinely is in all of our bodies and all of our potentials all the time. And if we have so much fear around singleness, it's just going to keep creating this divide. And so the hope is that we can start breaking that down a little bit and make it less of a scary thing and see it more as just like one of the many circumstances that we might have in our lives.
Yeah, totally. And something that we all belong to. We all belong to this story. And like, there's not this radical difference between somebody who's single and somebody who's married. And I mean, there's so much in our theology that supports thinking that way. Exaltation is literally connected with marriage in our tradition.
To me, this is the stickiest part of the conversation. Like, how do you reconcile this doctrine that is really about partnering? It's so much in our theology. It's not one of these things where we can be like, this is just a cultural issue and we all need to just stop with the judging. It's so in our theology that I don't see an obvious fix. It just is a pain that is there. And I don't know how to do it. I know we do. I know we make it worse sometimes, but can you talk about how you sort of reconcile this fact that it's really entwined in our like deep theology?
Well, and it's not just in our theology, it's also in our bodies, like it's in our anthropology. There are a lot of things that would drive us to partner that have nothing to do with our theology. And so, I mean, it's something that keeps coming up with Diana and I, is that we can't just tie this up with a nice bow. There's just no way to do it.
Yeah.
You know, when we first started talking about doing a podcast, Diana, I think very astutely brought up, like, I don't think we want to be making this like rah singleness is the way. It's not that, but it's also not like feel bad for us, we're the most beleaguered of all peoples. You know what I mean? Like, we don't want to do either of those things. And it's in part because I think you have to hold this tension of being and feeling happy and whole with your circumstance today, but also this drive, this longing, whether it's longing for a partner, a drive to go and find one, or the desire for partnered growth. We still believe that's beautiful, even if we also need to find what God has given us today beautiful. And I don't know that you can get around needing to hold the two things at the same time, because I think it's true in partnerships as well. You're not going to have the perfect partnership, but you're going to want to strive for it to be a little bit better. But can you also be happy with the way it is today? It feels like a very true principle to me.
Yeah. And it seems like to me that part of part of the challenge here too is that for the situation of being single, that's a public thing. I mean, it's public record, literally. Like everybody knows, everyone in your community, everyone in your family and network of friends. All of us have challenging circumstances, obviously. For married people, as it pertains to like relationship status, a lot of those challenges can be totally private, and nobody knows what might be going on in a marriage or in a relationship, and therefore can't have opinions about it, and can't
Mhm.
come to you with their agendas for how you should handle it. That's a very potentially very different situation uh, when you're talking about being single. And I'm curious, I guess, on a somewhat personal level, how you've experienced that in your adult lives, and what's been challenging about the sort of public nature of this particular circumstance.
I think that's exactly the way to put it, that singleness presents itself as a public thing, that it's just kind of in our cultural DNA, and definitely not just the church's culture. It's
Mhm.
much broader than that, right? It's not like the church made up marriage and reproduction, but just, yeah, of singleness kind of presenting itself as this itch that must be scratched. We got to partner that person up. I just got back from a family vacation a couple weeks ago, and I have to admit, being around my family, and I've got many siblings, and most of them are married, and um, every time I'm there, it brings up so much shame about the fact that I haven't done that with my life. I start getting so sensitive whenever little things happen, like, oh, Mary's helping with the dishes. Why didn't I think to do that? Or like, oh, that person's so good with kids, not me. It just like is this perpetual loop in my head. There must be something about me that is just really incompetent, and that's why I can't make this work. And what's hard is I feel like my family is doing that with me too. And it's always really hard for me to tell how much is me projecting onto them and how much are they actually feeling this way. And I'm certain it's a lot of both. I just think it's hard for people to really look at a person and be like, you're totally fine and whole, and I see you and I can just appreciate you. Instead, I often do worry and feel that like my life presents itself to other people as like a problem. I think it'd be a good exercise, in fact, for married people to think about like every time they bump up with the problems in their marriage, and times when they're like, oh gosh, I'm not very good at loving someone in this way, or I'm not very open hearted in this way, or this is my perpetual weakness or flaw that keeps coming up. And normally probably just your family sees that, but I feel like being single, it just can feel like everyone around you is doing the math to try and read into your flaws and figure out like that must be why she's not married or he's not married or whatever. And you know what, I'm not here saying that unmarried people are more mature or that we don't have anything to work on. Of course we do. It's just there is such a discrepancy in the public nature of singleness and the private nature of marriage in terms of how much people are scrutinizing your flaws. And I think married people just get this like leg up in terms of how people regard them.
Yeah, it's almost like you get like a somebody picked you badge when you get married, that it helps you get into clubs. And honestly, I think that we might just overvalue that badge is all. I think both as married people and single
Yeah.
people, because people pick you all the time in ways that you just don't appreciate. And I have been picked and chosen for so many things in my life and so many relationships that I've loved. But for some reason, this relationship, a partnered marriage relationship, has not come up in my life. And so somehow I carry that around as a sign that I'm not worthy. And I think other people do too. That's one of the reasons it's hard, is because of what Diana's talking about, that there's a sort of misunderstanding that we're all carrying. I feel like looking at it almost like beauty culture is really helpful, where beauty culture is an issue that especially affects women. This ideal beauty standard, it really is just super suppressive and awful. But women help uphold it by believing it and buying into it too. It's not just, oh, men are awful. And it's like, because it's sort of invisible to all of us, we all uphold it in a way that can be really damaging to everyone. It holds us all back to think that women are supposed to look a certain way and be a certain way. And I feel the same way about this, that singleness is something that when approached with no judgment allows you to make choices in your life that aren't based in fear, whether it's a choice to stay or leave a marriage that may or may not be actually healthy for you, or whether it's a choice to marry or not marry a partner. The goal here is to be able to make peace with whether or not,
Yeah.
wherever you are on that spectrum of singleness, instead of feeling like this is repulsive and
Yeah.
and therefore, or this would mean publicly I'm unworthy, and hopefully more to be able to see it as a very whole qualified life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, thank you. Just, you can go, Tim, but I like both of you. Thank you so much. I can feel how true this is. And I know that's so vulnerable to talk about, but it feels like there's so much pain on this exact issue. And I think you both articulated it so well. So thanks for being really open about that.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
totally
Tim.
agree. And I wanted to ask a question that I genuinely don't know the answer to, and it's it's that I guess I have several close friends who are single, and my approach when talking with them has sort of like always been I'm the guy that doesn't bring up the fact that they're single.
Sure.
Um,
Mm.
and this is I'm talking about relationships in the church, you know?
Mhm.
And I've always I guess for a long time I've kind of like thought it's probably true that in, 50 to 90% of their other relationships, people are like, wink, wink, well, hey, you dating anyone or whatever. And I'm like, they must get so tired of that, you know? And so I try to like be a reprieve. But also, I guess I've noticed that over the years, I actually think that our relationship, our relationships have suffered a little bit um
Mhm.
for not ever going there. Like there's a
Mm.
certain lack of depth when you don't talk about the potential for a partnered or married relationship. And so I guess I'm curious for you both when you're talking with married friends, what is the approach from them that is actually helpful and actually makes your relationship deeper and doesn't convey an agenda all at the same time?
Mm.
Mm.
Mm. Very good
I
question.
Yeah, I immediately well, it's so funny because I feel like I've dealt with both sides of that coin. And Diana and I have talked about this a little bit, that for a long time I think we both felt like our singleness was because we were cool. Like, oh yeah, we're girls who aren't going to get married before we're 25, or by the time I graduated from BYU, I was like, oh, that was never going to be my story. I'm too independent. And that is super not a judgment of anybody. That's just my own naivete and like just like egomania, I guess. But eventually, I think probably around 30, the script started to change. And also the way people talk to me about it, like the way people talk to me about who I was dating when I was 21 and I was going to BYU, it's very different than the sort of soft touch that people tried to take later on. So it's almost like we're just not going to get it
Mm.
right in conversation with each other. So I think we have to just, listen to our hearts and really just try to show people that we love and that we care. Because it's possible that no matter what, but somebody not asking me sometimes felt like, well, they gave up on
Mhm.
me. They think I'm never going to get married. They stopped asking. Even Aunt Hilda stopped asking. You know what I mean? Which is saying something, But I think there was this beautiful exercise in Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, where she breaks down a life into a pie chart. And there are sort of all these different elements, your social life and your spiritual life and your physical life, your health. And there was one slice that was romance slash adventure. And I've always really loved
Wow.
that category, that it's like, are you having adventures in your life? What's on the horizon for you? What are you excited about right now? Like, what's like sticking in your craw right now? Like, what are you having a hard time with? I think there's a way that we can approach single people and wonder what's on their minds and hearts, without just being like, hey, fix that single problem yet, but still being able to ask, are you excited about anything right
Mm.
now? And I
Mhm.
think sometimes people forget or are worried about asking the dating question, but every once in a while I have some seriously good stories that I wish I could share. But I also don't want to be that single person who just talks about being single and dating and stuff all the time, like, hey, I got another crazy experience to tell everybody about from my latest Hinge conquest. And it's it's wild. But yeah, it's just, I feel the same way sometimes with my married friends, right? Remembering that I feel a little less well versed in what it's like to be a new mom, or what it's like to be kind of a super tired parent with your partner. And so I think kind of trying to get at the root of what we're really trying to ask, like, what are you worried about right now? And what are you wondering about right now? And what are you know, what is really consuming your mind and heart space right now? I think there's a way to get deeper than some of these questions where I'm like, I don't know what to ask. Like, how's breastfeeding? You know, it's like, you know, but I really hope that if we like root down into how much we really care about people, that they'll feel it and hopefully start opening up about what might be a really interesting thing for us, even if it's not our experience.
Yeah.
There's a faculty member at the Living School named James Finley who always talks about how you can't really guarantee you can't guarantee, you know, transcendent moments or feelings of connection, even with people, with God or with people, but you can always practice the posture that offers the path of least resistance. And that is so empowering to me. I know I don't know what to ask, but I love the idea that what is always mine to choose is practicing this posture of connection and choosing to be in proximity with people I want to connect with and having conversation and trusting that we'll be able to connect even if I don't know exactly what to ask. But also at the same time, on this particular issue, I feel like in a lot of ways, I have a lot of separation from single people in my life because I don't see them at church. Even if they're my literal neighbors, they're going to a different ward. We're not, you know, running into each other in the same circles. I feel like there's so much to be had with this multitude of perspectives and voices. And in some ways, it kind of feels like this perspective of singleness has sort of been carved out of our community. And so what do you think about singles wards and the way we're sort of dividing? Is there a way that seems obvious to you that we could be more together so that we can have this connection that we're looking for?
Yeah, I there's a lot to say about this. We're gonna do an episode with Sharon Harris, who wrote a history of singles wards, and
Oh,
I've
wow.
actually had a little bit of a journey as I've been thinking about it. I started this thinking exactly the way you were, Aubrey, where I was like, this is so bad. We're so divided from each other. We're invisible. I do think that's a problem in the way that you're talking about, that like family wards or traditional wards just don't have awareness, and like there's just so few opportunities to talk to singles. At the same time, I also think there's a lot of opportunity to use singles wards if they were less a holding ground for people until they get married, like something you're supposed to graduate from. And if we could move our mindset in the church to thinking about like, hey, singleness is actually an incredibly potent life situation to like be serving God and serving the community in other ways. What is the vocation that singles can be focusing on? Maybe like singles boards should have focused service projects in the community that they're able to do and things like that. Because, you know, and this goes back to the question of like, what do you do about singleness? We want to make a culture where people aren't treated individually like they are a problem, or that this is a problem that they constantly need to get on, because there's just so much that's beyond people's control and that's really damaging. At the same time, singleness does present a lot of unique challenges that I do think we want to take seriously. Chronic loneliness, a lack of purpose and direction. It's really easy to just kind of devolve into a consumeristic lifestyle what you just don't have any, like you don't have the kinds of structures calling you out of yourself that like a spouse and children would do every single day. I do think that there are serious spiritual challenges that singles face. So if people think dissolving singles wards and just letting everybody be one happy family is the way to go, I think there's a lot of great that could come from that. I also think there's a missed opportunity with singles wards to make them places to actually take up the challenges that singleness brings, and to build creative ways for people to find new kinds of purpose and to articulate what embeddedness in relationships and community can look like outside of family life. Because I think a lot of singles want help with that question.
Thanks,
Well,
Dana.
and I think that there is kind of no way to get around the current reality that we're dealing with, regardless of where you land on whether or not we should have singles wards, is that we currently do. You know,
Yeah.
so we currently do have singles wards, and I do think you're right, Aubrey, that they are creating a little bit more of a gap You know, they're creating a little bit more of a gap between like the conversations that Diana's describing, which are beautiful. And I think we're up for the challenge, but how often do we have the opportunity when single people are over here and married people are over here, and you know, never the two shall meet so often. And I think that right now, I guess I'm just trying to hold space for that right now our culture is actually exacerbating this problem. And I think that means maybe we need to lean in and put a little more elbow grease in to try and really take care of this. If you have a new single person move into your ward, go and use it as an opportunity to do some to find out more about that experience, and give yourself the grace and compassion of like, I'm going to be nice to myself if I say the wrong thing, because I hope they'll feel my heart, because it's just an unfamiliar experience, but it is not something that needs to get in the way of connecting, you know?
Yeah, very well
So
said.
I guess so. One thing I'm thinking about is that there are all of these sort of like problematic myths or falsehoods, even you could call them, about being single, that you two have at least implied so far, like this idea that I'm not worth as much until I get married, or like there's something wrong with me. You know, the sort of like internalized shame. And I wonder if you feel like most of this sort of like embedded cultural thinking that's problematic comes from married people, or is there some sort of like internalized culture in singles wards or in singles communities where this gets perpetuated as well?
I think it's internalized. What do you think, Diana? I think it's just everywhere.
It's everywhere. And it's not just the church. It's
Yeah.
definitely not.
Watch modern rom-coms. Like the lead is
Yeah.
always like,
Yeah.
I'm 34 and I'm single, and all of her aunts and uncles are like, oh, she's gonna die alone. Like they're not
Right.
born.
Yeah. So my thought on this too, I wish as a church that we would just tap into our deeper roots as a community and like what we're really about. Because, you know, Joseph Smith, throughout his life, like a lot of the revelations he was receiving were really about, let's expand our notions of community and how we are carrying each other through life as Zion and as a people. And I think he was very concerned with the like isolating effect that happens when you really only focus on your own and your isolated family, right? And we've come to really celebrate that model of like every family, that's the core unit, and then the church just supports families. What do? The church did not invent marriage. It didn't invent this pressure to get married and the prominent place that marriage and reproduction has in the human journey. And I actually think early church teachings were trying desperately to help us think just so much bigger about what human community can look like. And I would love us to have a big imagination. And I think that the nuclear family model, it's just, I'm not saying that it's wrong or that I'm positing something else is better, but it certainly is not, it's not holding people right now. If it is the case that up to 50% of people don't even fit into that in the church, we really just need to think bigger about how we're connecting people to each other and how we belong to each other. And this hunkering down with your spouse and kids model, it leaves a lot of people uncared for.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this one of my favorite books of all time is Adam S. Miller's book, An Early Resurrection, Life in Christ Before You Die. I love that book. And there's a section where he talks about how the law, if you're not careful, you can end up worshiping the law instead of worshiping God. And sometimes I feel that a little bit with the nuclear family in our culture, that you can end up worshiping the nuclear family instead of worshiping God, especially in Utah culture, this sort of like all the perfect children wearing all the cute Sunday clothes, they all serve missions. You know, it's like this idea that like, I did it, I nailed it, I created heaven on earth, and I have created my perfect. I hope this doesn't sound too accusatory. I really don't mean it this way, because I also am guilty of the same sort of things, but I've created a perfect ego identity. It's almost like an Instagram version of life where like I am actually like holding up the family and the house and the kids and the job. Sometimes Diana and I talk about it as like we have a little bit of a fairy tale problem. You know, the happily ever after is supposed to be something that you get and then just coast on for the rest of your life. And it actually is not serving any of us to think of it that way.
I mean, there are so many ways in which our world right now, whether you're in or out of the church, whether family is your idol or something else, makes you confuse an image of life with life itself. and makes you confuse like the markers of adulthood and of growth with actual growth. I personally am not interested in a world where we further weaken family and make it more difficult for people to like partner and stay in, through the difficulties of marriage and having children. I want to see a world where we have more of that. But also, it's never been the only way that people grow. And so I think just like trying to have an anchor on what growth looks like, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And what is the picture of human flourishing that we want to see here? And singleness is something that, yeah, will just be the situation for a lot of people. Not everybody will get married and have kids. So what does it look like instead to devote ourselves to other human beings? I just think we just need to be more creative about how we can embed people in rich relationships and opportunities to serve each other.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, Diana. I think I also just feel like I'd love to extend this challenge, not just to anybody who might be listening, but to myself as well. Can we just investigate our fears and judgments on this subject and see what it does for our hearts and minds to investigate them? You know, Tim, you were touching on some of the sort of assumptions, you know, that people make about single people. You know, is there a way that, like, what would happen to your heart and mind if you were to think, what if this person is 100% on their path, and can I support them, and can I love them as they are now? And what happens in the room when they feel that, instead of, oh, I'm worried they're going to be too set in their ways? I think, you know, just investigate how you're approaching. And an example for single people, I think, that I've seen a lot, I'm sure Diana has too, but especially because we have such a concentrated culture in Utah, I know a lot of people who are living there who are probably just there because their chances of dating will go up if they stay in Utah and they're afraid to leave. And I say that with zero judgment. You know, I lived in Utah for 11 years before I moved to LA, and I may move back, but I really hope it won't be, because I'm terrified I won't get married if I pursue a dream that takes me to Norway or something like that, for example. And I think that question also, what if you were just to completely trust God in this situation, instead of trying to do the math and trying to figure out the statistics of what will make it most likely for me to find a partner? What if I just trusted God? Again, like, what happens to your heart and mind when you investigate that fear? This is one of the reasons I think Diana and I want to do this so badly, because it's like, I think there's a lot to offer if we're able to approach these fears and judgments, both from the single side and the married side. It's like, I think there's a lot of growth here we can do together.
Yeah. I have always felt like this is one of the issues where there's just been a huge discrepancy between what I felt from God on this topic and like what I feel from society, including the church, but broader than that as well. Ever since I was young, you know, and you're dating and trying to figure out who you like and when you're going to actually be interested enough to want to commit to somebody or whatever it is, you know, as I've prayed about it, I have always had this very consistent sense that God's been like, wrong question. Why are you obsessed with this? There are so many interesting questions you should be thinking about, Diana, and that's not one of them. Like, try again, new question. And I don't know what other people feel. You know, I obviously hear stories all the time when people are like, yeah, and then I, you know, through prayer, I learned that I should move here, and then I met this person. But that's just never how it's been for me. And it has been like a very consistent and clear point of guidance for me in prayer that, like, I actually shouldn't focus on marriage, that I should focus instead on grappling with other sets of questions that society is going through and things like that. And those are the things that I felt like God has called me to think about. Just another set of questions, which is just to say, it's like, in other religions, the call to singleness is like an actual thing. And it's considered a holy thing, even, where you can devote yourself in a single-minded way towards God. And I have definitely felt that in my spiritual life. You know, I've sometimes wondered, I was like, does that mean I'm going to be single forever or just now? And it's really hard for me still to think about a life where I never get married. I'll admit that's a scary thing to consider. But I will also admit, like, whenever I have really prayed about this, I have always felt reassured by God. Don't give in to that pressure. I need you to be working on other things. And I wonder if we really believe that that's possible in our church. Certainly a lot of other holy traditions more than believe that's possible. That's even a path that receives praise.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we don't really even consider that as a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We did this episode with Valerie Hamaker recently about approaching a situation where somebody else is taking a spiritual journey that you are not on, and that looks really different than yours.
Mm.
You know, in some cases it could be someone, for example, leaving the church. And she articulated really well, I think, that what causes a lot of tension in those relationships, when people's paths diverge, and a lot of the problems that arise, is at its core, it really is fear. And I think the
Mhm.
fear is so similar to the fear that you two are articulating, which is that we sort of make I think we can tend to make God really small and God's plans for people really
Yeah.
small, and imagine the path that we're all supposed to be on as this itty bitty narrow thing, and it looks the same for everybody, and everybody's got to be on this path. And I think my instinct, you know, as my own sort of like faith has shifted over the last, 15 years, has been that uh, that God is so much bigger than we can even imagine. God's paths for different people can be so much bigger and more winding than we can imagine. And God's grace, like God's ability to hold us, is so much greater than we can imagine. And I think if we could walk around, and I don't do this by any means, but if we could sort of like walk around with that underlying sense all the time, then that fear, it might go away, about
Mm.
all of these different things. And I think you two are giving me such a good reminder, which is like, when you're experiencing attention, you can ask why a few times, and you're almost always going to end up at fear. And
Yeah.
then the question is, how do you address that fear? And I think if we can
Mhm.
focus on that, we'll probably be in a pretty good place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I follow up with that, Tim? Because I think some feedback that I've had after that conversation, even with Valerie, that I think is really valid. And I think that maybe what you just articulated is still the answer. But when someone's path doesn't look fruitful, it's easy to be
Mm.
like, oh, they're on a different path, when you can see that there's some wisdom, and it's different than yours, but some part of you can see that they're doing something different that is good for their soul. But when you're a parent or a friend or something, and it just seems like they're
Mm.
floundering, like they seem unhappy and miserable, or they're doing something dangerous, or like their path looks obviously destructive to you, then what? Because I think that's when we all
Mm.
feel our fear really
Mhm.
activate, and it makes us show up in kind of like manipulative ways out of love. Like
Mm.
we're
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
nervous for them because we love them
Totally.
so much that we want even more to make them do the thing that we think will be better. And so I guess what I hear all of you saying is that we can also trust that God's even that big. And like
Yeah.
even
Mhm.
these really scary parts of their story could even be made good eventually. And probably our call is going to look the same as if their path looked fruitful to us. Like
Mhm.
we're not going to fix them by trying to control or force them into our own story, but by being in that posture of love, so that they have a safe place to land when it gets better. But I don't know,
Mm.
thoughts about that? Because I think
Yeah.
Mhm.
probably anybody who's listening who has somebody in mind who's on that kind of path is probably feeling like an exception. I'm on board, except that in this case, this is going south. I think that fear just really activates us in ways that can be even harmful, maybe.
The number of times that I have floundered and people have extended their love and care and concern. I mean, it's an active regular part of my life. But it makes me think. I was volunteering at this women's shelter maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and during my training, they talked about how to support someone who was in an abusive relationship, and how often it can be very tempting to be like, leave him, like, get out of this relationship, get out of this situation, it's eating you alive. But what that would often do is sort of drive her closer to him, or to the abusive partner, because they're more accustomed to that. And then you end up alienating the relationship between you and this person that you're worried about. And I think it's obviously an extreme example, but it is pretty similar, where what is actually a more helpful thing to do in those situations is to say, I believe in you, and I know that you can do this no matter what, and I'll be here anytime you call. And
Mhm.
don't you just feel Christ in
Mhm.
that too? Do you think he's worried about us? Like, do you think he's worried and scared that we're not going to work it out? Or do you think he knows we can? That even if it looks really bad and only he and you are the ones who get it, I think he knows you can. you know?
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think the more that we can not let our fears drive the way we support people in their relationships and their faith journeys, I think the more that we will hopefully be able to see people flourish. It reminds me too of I can't remember who shared it. It was a general conference, maybe 2 conferences ago. Someone shared something Neil A. Maxwell's son had said after he died. They interviewed him and said, "What would you miss most about your dad?" And he said, "Family dinners on Sundays, because I always left feeling like my dad believed in me." And I
Mm,
just thought that was such a beautiful thing to be like, if anything, could we just, it's not, I believe you'll get married, but I just believe in you.
mm,
Like, I believe that you will make
yeah.
the absolute most of everything God puts in front of you. And I think you're doing a great job,
Mm.
even when you're like, you know what, this floundering, it looks really scary, but you're not drowning. You're alive and you've got
Yeah.
this. Like, that person needs to be told they can swim, not like, I'm pretty sure you're drowning.
Right.
You know what I
Wow.
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Yes. Wow.
I love
Thank you
that,
so much.
Mallory.
I do too. Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think, yeah, I agree with everything Mallory said. And Aubrey, to your point, one of the reasons that Mallory and I want to start this podcast and this conversation is because there's actually just so many different stories going on that are all true of like the
Mm.
population of single adults. There's people who might be like you said, stuck in an adolescence and can't figure out how to move forward with their lives. And I think that's the general frame that people have for what's happening with singles, which is problematic in all the ways that we've been talking about. But there is some truth to that too, right? That's definitely like a story that is out there. There's also people who are doing their best in absolutely every way and are constantly racking their hearts and brains to figure out how to be better and figure this out. It just doesn't happen. And then it's this story of like, what do you do when you're preparing yourself for a life and an opportunity that never comes your way? And what do you do in the midst of that? There's also, yeah, people who might feel called towards a kind of singleness. To lump the story of singleness as into all one thing, as though there's a single cause, it's just not the case. And so I think approaching it fearlessly and also just with an open mind, curious to learn about a person's unique trajectory and with curiosity towards what they've experienced, because even people who share the single status have very different stories about why they're there.
Yeah.
Thank you so
So
much.
true.
We've
Yeah.
just have learned so much from both of you and are so excited that this will be a continuing conversation on the podcast. But both of you are just have been so articulate and really so thoughtful. We just have learned so much from you both. And is there anything that we've missed that you want to make sure we touch on before we wrap up? Of course, people can continue the conversation on your podcast.
I would just say, I think what we hope with this podcast is that it'll be a place that helps people grapple with some of the really practical questions that come up in this space when your sense of what your future should look like has only presented one option for you. Like, what do you do when you find yourself facing all sorts of other questions you never thought you would have to face, right? Dating inside or outside the church is like a common one that I think Mallory and I talk about a lot, that we and our friends are grappling with. And law of chastity things, which just gets complicated.
We want to go there. You know what I mean?
We want to go
we're
there
interested in
and
talking
just,
about all of it.
yeah, and the good and the bad. And I hope it'll be a place that people feel a sense of wholeness and ease. There are other people wrestling with these questions, and you're not alone in thinking like, huh, I never thought I would end up here, yet here I am. Um, and yeah, also help work through some of the elephants in the room that rarely get named. So that's our hope for it.
I think another one that I think you mentioned early on as we were discussing sort of the tenets of the podcast, Diana, was that the world is big, and that and kind of what Tim was saying earlier, like that God is big, that we have every reason to hope for an adventure, for a lot to come up in our lives that could be interesting and exciting, and to try and sit in that magic of the unknown together a little bit more. That is one of the things that I think that single people are like professional uncertainty, grapplers.
Yeah.
and for us to kind of sit in that space together of ultimate potential all the time, but it's just all unmet potential, but it's still potential. And it can feel really, really good to remind yourself that there is genuine space to create a lot of hope and a lot of magic and a lot of creativity because there's so much uncertainty in your life. So we're very excited to get the conversation going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
totally.
you two are just awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the launch of your podcast, and we just really love and appreciate you both.
Thank you. And thanks for having us on and for helping us figure out how to talk about this.
Thank you both so much.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Mallory Everton and Diana Brown. You can find their podcast, The Soloists, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.